Welcome back. In this video, we are going to talk about how we can configure beans and what are the bean scopes available and how to use them. Let us understand how we can configure beans in a Spring application. So here I have a simple Maven project and I have configured only Spring context library. It is not a Spring Boot application. So first let us understand how Spring's bean configuration works, because it is same even in Spring Boot application also. Okay, so let us take a quick look at what code we have here. So we have a customer class with few properties, and then we have customer repository class with a simple method, and we have customer service which has customer repository dependency, and there is one get customer method, and we have order repository and also order service. In order service we have injected both order repository and customer repository as well, and there is one method get customer orders and which takes customer ID, and at the moment it is simply returning a empty list. So now in order to use this application as a Spring application, we need to register the beans. Right now we have created annotation config application context and specified the base package comms.sivalabs.da, and we are trying to fetch a customer service object from the context and then trying to call one method. But right now if you simply run the application, it's gonna throw exceptions saying that no qualifying bean of type customer service, because we have nowhere indicated these beans should be registered in the application context. So one of the common ways of registering bean these days is using annotations, and there is several types of annotation which you can use, but the first annotation that we can look at it is using at component. So this is a base annotation which indicates this class should be considered as a Spring bean. So now if we register this bean, we also need to register the dependencies as well. So let us annotate customer repository as well as a bean. Now if we run the application, so it is working fine and it simply written a customer object. But here only this customer service and customer registry repository will be registered as the beans, but not any other beans like order repository or order service. They are not going to be registered as of now. Okay, so let us register these beans as well at component, and also we need to register. So let us say if we don't register order service, customer repository is marked as component, but order repository is not registered as a bean. So if we try to run the application, it's going to fail saying that no qualifying bean of type order repository. Okay, so we should register all the beans that we are trying to inject. So again I'm annotating this at component. Now it should work fine. Now there is this at component annotation which is kind of a base annotation, but there are more specific annotations that you can use for specific scenarios. For example, here order repository, usually you create repositories that talks to some kind of a database and then fetch the data. So here instead of at component we can use at repository. At repository is nothing but a meta annotation which is annotated with at component. Okay, but why we should use at repository instead of at component, right? So the reason being, by using at repository there are some additional benefits that we get, such as when we are talking to the database might encounter some error exception, which usually through SQL exception. But when you are annotating with at repository, Spring infrastructure takes care of converting that SQL exception into more fine-grained and specific exception like data access exception or lock acquired exception, something like that, which is more specific and more meaningful. So for beans which are kind of a repositories, it is better to use at repository instead of a generic at component. Okay, next, and usually we have repositories and also service layer. Usually in a 3-tier architecture you have a web layer which are kind of a controllers, and then you talk to business services, and then which talks to repositories, right? So similar to repositories, we also have at service annotation, which is again a meta annotation annotated with at component. Okay, as far as I know, there are no semantics of similar to repositories, but it's kind of a marking saying that this component is a business service. Okay, and usually when you are talking to a database, this is the layer you usually add at transactional to make the entire service layer as a transactional boundary. Okay, and usually if you have a Spring MVC or you are building either a web application or REST APIs, you add at controller or at REST controller on the controller components. Okay, so this is one way of registering your beans into the application context, and then you can look up the beans using annotation config application context, and then you create application context by specifying where to look for the beans. So Spring is going to scan all the classes in this package and all its sub packages, looking for the beans that has at service, at component, at repository, at controller, every annotation that it knows, and then register all of them as beans. Okay, and then once you have a reference to context, you can get any bean you want and you can use whatever the methods you want to use. Okay, this is one way of registering the beans. There is another way, like instead of annotating all these classes with Spring annotations, you can just make them completely independent of any Spring dependencies. Okay, right now there is nothing specific in this class about Spring. It is completely independent of any Spring code. Okay, so now if you run this application, obviously it's gonna fail because we have not registered anyway. So there is another way using Java configuration. So you can create a configuration class, which is nothing but a simple class at configuration. Okay, and you should annotate this with at configuration annotation. Okay, once you have this, usually a class with this at configuration class is called configuration class. So here what you can do, you can register any bean that you want to register using Java configuration like this. Okay, first you want to register customer repository, right? So customer repository, and you mark this as at bean, and here you can create a bean whichever the way you want to. And similarly, you want to register a customer service bean. Okay, so here you can create new customer service. Here you need a customer repository dependency in order to create customer service. You can inject that in two ways. Like you can simply call the method, this above method that will return a customer repository. This also works, but I would prefer to inject whatever the dependencies that we need for this customer service through this method arguments. Like here I need customer repositories. I will use that. So here Spring will take care of determining the order. Like before registering customer service, it knows that it needs an instance of customer repository. So first it will create an instance of this and then pass that to this method and then construct the customer service. I prefer this way instead of calling the customer repository method directly over here, because it looks meaningful. Like for this to construct a customer service, it needs these dependencies. So both the ways works, but this is the preference I have. Like it makes clear to me that which bean definition requires what kind of a dependency, just looking at this signature. Okay, so now that we have registered both customer repository and customer service, let us run this application, and it is working fine again. How? Because we specified com.sivalabs.di as the base package, Spring is going to scan in this entire package looking for either annotated beans or any configuration class. So if it found any configuration classes, it's going to register all these beans like this, defined using @bean into the application context, so that we can look up the beans, whatever bean we want, and then we can use, just like it's gonna work exactly same as if we annotate these classes with @service or @component or whatever the annotation is appropriate. Okay. Now the question is, why should I go for one over the other? Like, why can't I simply add @service or @component instead of creating a class and then registering beans like this? It's kind of a more typing, right? Simply annotating @component or @repository is simpler. The reason is, let's say if we are the owners of all these classes, of course you can go ahead and add all these annotations to these classes, but sometimes we use third-party libraries where we want to register a bean of that third-party library, and obviously we can't annotate or do anything to add any of these metadata annotations on those classes. So then the only way is to use this bean configuration, Java bean configuration. Let's say we are using JPA and we want to register some entity manager factory or something like that. Obviously you can't annotate that entity manager factory with @repository or @component, anything, right? So this is the way you should register using Java configuration. That is one reason. And another reason, it's more like a personal preference. So some people prefer their code not to pollute with any framework code or anything like that. They want to keep it to the bare core Java, so that they can use with any other frameworks. Right now there is nothing specific, Spring specific in this code, right? So some people prefer that way, like they simply create the classes without having any framework specific things, and then they use configuration classes to register this. And it's kind of also look like a blueprint. At one place you can see how the application is configured, and even if you are going for a modularized application, it's going to help in this way also. So it's kind of a more personal preference. Let us talk about bean scopes. What is bean scope? So Spring offers different scopes for registering these beans. Like there is a prototype scope, there is singleton scope, and then in the context of web application there are request scope and session scope beans as well. So what do I mean by scope? Let us understand that. So here I have created an application context, and then I registered beans using Java configuration. I mean, it doesn't matter whether I register beans using Java configuration or using annotation, the scope concepts applies the same. So here I retrieved a bean of type customer service from the application context. So if I print out customer service dot hash code, okay, I can see the hash code of this customer service. So this is the hash code of it. So let us imagine I again try to retrieve a customer service bean. Let's make it customer service 2, and I am printing customer service 2 hash code. Okay. Now if I print it, it's going to print the same thing, like the same hash code. Obviously they are pointing to the same object, because this customer service is registered as a bean without specifying any specific scope configuration. By default it's going to be considered as a singleton scope bean. So when the application started, Spring is going to scan all these bean definitions and annotated classes and then register them into the application context once. And then whenever you want to retrieve a bean of certain type, it's going to check, is this bean already created? If so, it's going to return the same bean. It's not going to create the same bean again and again whenever you retrieve. That is when you are using the default scope, which is singleton scope. However, If you make this as a prototype bean, like if you annotate this with add scope and specify prototype, okay. Now if you run this application, here in the main method we are fetching this customer service from the application context 2 different times, okay. And when we print the hash code, here we can see it gives 2 different hash codes. That means they are 2 different objects. So whenever you are asking application context for a specific bean which is registered with a prototype scope, it's going to give a new customer service object, okay. Whereas when you are using the default scope, it's going to return the same bean no matter how many times you ask for it, okay. Now is the interesting part, and also this is very a common interview question, like how it behaves when you inject a prototype bean into a singleton bean. So usually in interviews people ask, let's say you have a controller and then you have injected a service which is registered as a prototype bean into that controller. So how many instances, let's say we get 2 web requests for some API endpoints. So how many service instances it gets created when you get 2 web requests? Some people get confused thinking, okay, it is a prototype bean, that means it's going to create 2 different beans for 2 different requests. No, that's not how it works. So here you need to understand that it's not going to create a new bean based on the number of web requests you get, okay. By default, when you say prototype bean, whenever you ask for a prototype bean, when you are looking up application context for a prototype bean, it's going to create a new instance and then inject into other beans. Once they are injected, they are going to continue, because once they are injected into a singleton bean, they are going to continue using the same bean. It's not going to create a new bean based on the web request, okay. That is how it works. And another interesting thing to observe is, let's say here we have customer repository, okay, and we injected that customer repository into customer service, and also we injected that into order service as well, right? Here we injected this one. Now let us make this customer repository a prototype scope bean. Let's go to app configuration. Instead of customer service, let us make customer repository prototype scope bean, okay. Now we are injecting this into both customer service and order service as well. Now in our main method, instead of looking up this, let us look up order service. And okay, in order service, let's say, okay, let me simply call this method order service dot get customer some here, and also here let me call customer service dot get customer, okay. So in this both the methods, let me print the hash code of this customer's repository. Okay, and here in this method I am going to print the same customer repository. So just I'll add and in customer service okay. So again I'm going to just repeat what we are doing here. So here we have customer service with customer repository dependency, and in this method before returning the data we are simply printing the customer repository's hash code, and we are doing the same thing when we are calling get customer orders, printing the customer repository hash code. In our main method we are fetching customer service from the application context and also got order service and then call this method. Now if I run this application, what happened? No qualifying bean of type order service. Of course I need to make this bean. Okay, and here is another thing, like you can mix and match. There is nothing like, okay, once you go for a configuration class you need to register all this. No, you can mix and match both the approaches using JavaConfig and also annotation based approach. Okay, here I can add this and make this also repository. So now I should be able to run this application, and this is the interesting thing here. So here in customer service we printed customer repositories hash code. In order service we printed the hash code of customer repository. They are both different hash codes because we registered this customer repository as a prototype scope bean. When you start the application, it's going to create a new bean and then inject into all its dependent objects. That's the end of it. It is not like whenever you call a method on some order service or customer service, it's not going to create a new bean of customer repository. But when you bootstrap your application, it is going to create a new bean and inject into all its dependent beans. Okay, so that is the point I want to make. Okay, so that is how we can register our beans using both annotations and using Java configuration. We can also register lifecycle callback methods as well. Let's say in customer service we want to do some initialization logic as soon as customer service instance is created. So what we can do, we can create a method void init, and then you can annotate with post construct. Okay, so here you can write whatever the logic you want to write, and similarly you can also provide a cleanup method like void destroy and annotate with at pre-destroy. So Spring will take care of calling the init method as soon as it created an instance of customer service, and also it's going to call this destroy method before destroying this bean. Okay, this is how you can use this annotated method if you are going for annotation based configuration. But if you are following this JavaConfig approach, you can also come here and then specify init method is init. You should give the method name, and then you can also specify destroy method name is destroy. Okay, so when you mention these methods like this using JavaConfig, you don't need to add these annotations. Okay, so this is how you can configure lifecycle callback methods. So I hope you understand these two different ways of registering the beans using annotations and then using JavaConfig and when to use what. And I hope you find this video useful. Thank you. Bye-bye.